Chip, Chip, I've known Chip a long time, and so it's just easy to use his first name, but I consider him a good friend from OSU, and Chip and I have talked on a number of different subjects and things like that, but I know this is one that he's always near and dear to his heart because he does have that interaction with Deer. So Chip, thank you so much for speaking today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, no, we're very similar counties, and that I think has helped a lot over the years, understanding each other. So now, why is this not going forward? Oh, okay. Well, basically, west of the Cascades, we have three major species of deer and elk. We have the Columbian black-tailed deer, which is the most dominant one in most of our county, at least. And we do have the white-tailed deer with locations along the Columbia River. And now they're kind of moving inland just a little bit, but most of them are in the semi-riparian areas along the Columbia River and tend not to be a generalized problem in Columbia County so far. I do think in in Cowlitz County, I think you have a little bit more activity from the white-tailed deer. So
that's true.
Yeah, and I know it's been a preservation issue in Oregon. So we'll talk about it a little bit. And then Roosevelt elk at higher elevations in the summer, lower in the winter, and that has been an interesting problem for us this year. So let's talk briefly about these three species. The Columbia black-tailed deer is the one we all know. I describe it as the deer found in every block in Columbia County, given the opportunity. They are everywhere. They eat a huge variety of native and non-native plant material, eat a lot of woody plants, but also all manner of other vegetation. And they're always surprising me in some years as to what they decide to eat they have never eaten before. So they're explorers, apparently culinary explorers, and working that out. They're very nimble and can move pretty quickly to escape predators. Their main predators are cougar, coyotes, especially with regard to the fawns, dogs, cars, and other human activities like hunting. And then there's several diseases that have had an impact on them, and we could talk about them more a little bit later on if you want to. But anyway, they typically don't challenge fencing if it's well constructed, and we're going to be getting to some detailed discussion on fencing in a little bit. So that's the major deer that we're facing. The white-tailed deer, as I mentioned, mainly in the corridors along the Columbia. There's been an effort, and as I mentioned, in Columbia County to increase the populations. They're mainly grass feeders with some forbs, so herbaceous perennials, biennials, annuals, so things other than grass, broadleaf plants other than grass. I think their survival and survivability has actually been challenged by the invasion of reed canary grass in the landscape along the lower Columbia. It is a terrifyingly efficient plant in taking over things, but it's got some complex issues with regard to nutrition and toxic compounds in reed canary grass. So I think that has actually had a negative impact on the ability of the white-tailed deer to really take off as they used to, given its ubiquity in the lower Columbia. So anyway, there's an actually interesting story about white-tailed deer. Some were brought down to an area kind of fairly down upriver into Clark County at a refuge there, and some made it over to, because they were all tagged, some made it over to the to Sauvie Island, and then I'm not sure whether they must have swum to Sauvie Island from the Columbia River, because there is no bridge there. There is a bridge from Sauvie Island to Highway 30 on our side, so they could have crossed the bridge, but they ended up first in Scappoose, and then one of them ended up coming out about 6 miles from Scappoose into our yard with the tag on. And so this creature had gone a long way and was clearly one that was destined to survive if it really did swim the river. So anyway, just like regular deer, they can be fenced out. Their predators are pretty much the same. Cougar, coyotes, dogs, people. Not so much, I don't think highway, because they're not so much on our highways so far anyway. And then the elk. And this was a banner year for elk. We have almost everybody I talk to who lives toward the river, say 0 to 8 or 10 miles away from the river, have talked about the amount of elk that they saw this year. Large numbers of herds, seemingly sometimes going together, sometimes coming apart, as herds do to a certain extent in the elk world. They're an interesting animal. They were pretty well destroyed and then reintroduced, and the genetics are a little complex, and I'm not going to be talking about that because I don't know enough about that. But their preference is for younger forests with a mix of vegetation, but we have them doing a lot of pasture feeding in our county, and they can actually take that pasture down pretty intensively if they have the population. So we've seen on one area that's about a 20-acre area that they're on fairly often 100 to 125 elk at a time. So they're quite the grass eaters as well. Their main predators are cougar and bear, apparently, on very young elk, and I did not know that until I was starting to put this together. And then humans from hunting predominantly. People have a lot of fear of fencing with elk, and there's some reason for that. But I have found in talking to a lot of people that have lived around elk for a long time, and our own experience with fencing is that they tend not to test fencing very much. Unless they're under stress, if there's a dog chasing them or a hunter chasing them or something like that, if stress happens, the fence is toast. They will go through that thing in no time at all, no matter what it's made of. I'm pretty convinced. So, but in general, they don't test fences, and I don't think they'll jump a 4-foot fence. I've seen them do that. That's well within their reach, but they tend not to try to jump larger fences than that. So basically, local populations are determined by what species are on the site. Are there cougar around? So, for example, where we live, which is only 2.5 miles off of Highway 30, a little more, 2 3/4 miles off of Highway 30, a cougar crossed a major road in that area that my wife walks often. So she was walking 9 o'clock in the morning, and the cougar just went right in front of her about 150 feet away. It was going not in her direction, the other direction, but yeah. So that's the cougar sightings, which is a whole nother story, are getting more common. I do think that a lot of people have wildlife cams, and so I think the same cougar is getting reported in a lot of different places and thought of by people in the community as being, more than one cougar, that when it really was just one cougar with a big range, which they do have. They have huge ranges. But anyway, so there's a lot of complexity about how animals end up where they are and that kind of thing. So anyway, I think all of you've known, if you've been around deer very often, that they alter natural and domestic landscapes. And the natural landscape was really brought to the fore when the New England communities began to start losing the color in their fall foliage, which was a big deal in New England. So they finally figured out that the plants that were recovering were only the plants that the deer wouldn't eat. And they were losing that mix of 20 or 30 hardwoods that they used to have, and it was kind of going down to about 6, which was far less interesting. So they started fencing things off and looking at the difference in what was left after doing that. And it was pretty dramatic, that the impact that the deer were having on that landscape. And we see that too. I do see I often describe the underfloor of most of our forests are composed of all the plants the deer won't eat. And that's, I think, so we are losing some plant species, or we're getting them in a lot smaller quantities, basically due to a high number of deer and their interest in certain ones. Okay, so deer and elk behavior, they're food explorers. They are pretty tuned to what their needs are. Needs are obviously highest for the female does in the deer or the female elk. During the time as their pregnancy is getting towards the end, and then right after their babies are born, the demand for milking the fawns or the small elk becomes higher and higher and higher. So they have to look, and they do look intensively for everything that has the highest protein, the easiest digestibility, everything that they need at that point in time to do it. So they will experiment with a lot of plants during that period of time, and they'll move and move and move and find what they think they need to do that. So. And you can see if there are cougars around the landscape or other predators, that you end up having more movement of the deer rather than them staying in one place, and you end up having a different landscape. And that's been developed, and that idea has been developed in Yellowstone and quite a few other areas as well, where they're looking at the impact of especially cougar on some of the native plant materials, which is generally positive because it does change the deer behavior. So okay, impact of deer browsing. Basically, if you're planting trees like Douglas fir trees, you get this, what I call a pincushion effect. That's not very good. But in general, what's happening with any time you get browsing, whether it's on an apple tree or your vegetables or anything like that, what you're doing is you're removing the photosynthetic surfaces and on the needles or the leaves or whatever it is, and that's reducing the ability to create more growth on top and more roots on the bottom, and it becomes a destructive circle if it's browsed pretty hard. So this is a stand that has been turned into pincushions by deer, basically, and eventually some of them escape. The one in the middle there, and there's some in the back, you can see they're kind of escaping, getting above the deer browse line, but everything else is being held to the pincushion condition. So you can see the antler kind of activity on the left, and then elk antler on the right. So that's pretty common. And again, we truly know deer doing pruning that we might need to do or maybe don't need to do, but they go ahead and take care of it. They're browsers. They use the juiciest bits, the tips of small trees, big trees, whatever they can get a hold of, vines, vegetables, all those kinds of things. They have lots of favorite foods, including the trailing blackberry. They're fairly fond of. They eat the regular, the non-native blackberry that used to be called Himalayan, now Armenian blackberry. Thimbleberry, they're very, very fond of those. Very fond of those, actually. So a lot of different things they'll eat. Again, here's another picture showing what happens if you keep removing leaves. In this case, leaves instead of needles. You get this photosynthetic drop and a successive weakening of the plant. And that does two things. One is it keeps it in the deer range more, and B, it just makes it more vulnerable to all sorts of other conditions that could happen. So having a lot of deer browse on a plant that you have an interest in keeping is generally not a good thing that you would want. So signs of deer presence, pretty straightforward. Deer droppings, deer skulls sometimes, deer browsing on the bottom left, and deer footprints. So here's some deer damage picture. More deer damage picture. And this one on the right to me was this was a project I worked on one time with a commercial nursery guy, and he was having trouble with deer, and they were eating, as you can see in this portion of a row on the right, they were eating certain clumps of those trees that were destined to be landscape trees, ultimately, when they were dug and sold. But once they're eaten like they are, their whole pattern is distorted, the way they grow is distorted, and they're useless at this point in time. So whatever value was in those before the deer got to them, the value is right now over, gone, nothing. So anyway, he worked on a lot of techniques to try to manage deer on his landscape. And he eventually came to the conclusion that the best thing to do was to move the plants that the deer like the most, the closest to the house and the barn where the farm dog was, and to put the plants the deer didn't like closest to the creek, which is where these plants were, until he realized that this was the wrong place for a plant that they liked. So anyway. So one other thing briefly on impact of deer. Well, we don't hear about this very much in a homeowner situation. It is certainly an issue commercially, and this is deer droppings with edible plants. And so the classic one that it's now almost 20 years old, I think, was a Dwala Juice Company, which is now, I think, gone. But it was linked to a what we call hemorrhagic E. coli outbreak. And it's a big deal. That disease is disease, bacterial disease is a big deal. There were some people that died, kidney damage, huge number of people. But the thing was, it was apple cider, and so you think, well, why would that do it? Or it was unpasteurized apple juice. Well, they were supposed to get the apples off the tree, but apparently some of the pickers were picking some apples off the ground. That was a no-no, but it was enough to contaminate a lot of the product and ended up with that. So they ended up having to go to flash pasteurization, and before I think they went out of business. And we had one in Oregon. This was strawberries, 2011. These were strawberries that were being sold not for IQF or individual quick freeze or for jams or anything like that, but being sold fresh market. And they ended up with some contamination from, this is actually a picture of deer in the field. It was the field in question. What made it a really complicated issue was that a lot was being sold for retail sales, but it was being sold to person X that sold part of it to person Y, who sold part of it to person Z, that moved around in a chain that was very difficult to do trace back on. So they couldn't recover the berries fast enough to keep other people potentially from getting sick from them. So that it was pretty serious there, very serious actually. So we know deer in edible gardens are not a good thing. That we do know that just from this hemorrhagic E. coli issue alone. So in terms of having a deer-resistant garden at all, well, it is kind of possible. There are plants that deer don't like to eat. This is kind of an old list here on the right, deer-resistant plants. It's not greatly up to date because there are plants in there that we don't want you to plant anymore, like English ivy. It's out of date. But the Sunset Garden Book has some good lists, and there's some other good lists from different like soil water conservation districts and things like that of plants that deer generally don't like to eat. But as I mentioned down here, deer don't read, and so they are testing, and so you can have a plant, especially in the ornamental nursery world, where you've got the plant species, but there are lots and lots of varieties. And in some cases, the varieties are not, they're what we call interspecific crosses. They can cross with a related plant species. And in the process, they may lose their deer resistance in the breeding process. So that definitely goes on. The thing is, though, in terms of deer resistance, there's not a lot for us to eat because most of the things that we like to eat, deer like to eat as well. So it's pretty straightforward there. So here are a few things that I will just put out to you. To a certain extent, I think winter squash plants are somewhat resistant, but I will tell you, I think that's really variable, dependent on the variety you're planting, maybe the availability of food and how desperate they are, because I've seen a person plant winter squash outside of a deer fence one year and it was fine, and the next year the deer were eating on it. And so I'm a little touchy on winter squash plants. I'm not completely convinced they're perpetually deer resistant. I don't think they are. I think there are varietal issues there. Potato foliage, most of the time they won't eat. Figs leaves, they don't eat. They will eat a little bit of fig leaves, but not a lot. But they love figs, and they'll get on their hind legs and knock the figs down if they can get to it. They don't eat persimmons, either the fruit or the leaves. And then I've got a garlic story. They typically don't eat garlic, but I was growing 9 varieties one year and in separate lines before we had a deer fence, and they ate one variety and left the other 8 alone. And that, how do you explain that? You can't. This is deer. Deer are they're very difficult to explain. Very difficult. So here are herbs that deer won't eat, and I'm willing to vet all of these. I've had them all outside a deer fence, and I've never had any problem with them eating any of them. So I'm pretty confident that those are good things, and a good use of some outside the deer fence space that's so valuable sometimes. In terms of native plants, this is again, we get into some mixed issues, but in general, I would argue all of these the deer can eat, or I have seen eat most of them. I've seen eat a little bit. For example, wild hazel, a certain time of the year they'll eat some, most of the time they don't. They certainly don't eat very much. Salal, they'll nibble a little bit every once in a while, or they'll nibble the salal berries, no problem. Oregon grape, not so much. Bald hip rose, I've actually never seen any sign of deer eating bald hip roses at all. Well, strawberry, if you get strawberries, they'll eat the strawberries, but they won't eat the foliage. And with sword fern, I've seen a little bit of nibbling, but not very much. So those are one set of some native plants that I think are more or less generally safe in terms of deer consumption. And then here's some others. So the one I'm least confident of is the columbine, because I definitely have seen deer eating on the native columbine, but I have had too many people tell me they don't eat their columbines, that there must be something to it, but I'm not 100% convinced on that. But some of the others, Iris 10X, they don't eat. Oxalis, they don't seem to eat. Trilliums, wild ginger, Stick-U, Ceanothus, that whole group, they don't seem to eat much. I have seen on coyote brush, which I'm not sure you have. It's not in Columbia County, it's on the coast for us. They will antler brush it, but I have not seen them eating it. So, and then manzanita, madrone, bearberry, all of those are ones that if the deer are eating it, they're not eating it in any degree that it causes trouble. So here are some that are deer safe. So in general, these were all non-native types of trees and shrubs that were widely planted by early settlers for the perfectly good reason was that the deer didn't like to eat them. And so they were good things to have in a landscape because they would actually grow. So they will eat they can be a problem a little bit with Gary oak, which is if we're trying to plant Gary oak, they will browse that to some degree for sure, but some of the other oaks they don't. So okay, and roses, yes, mostly, and I would say rugosa roses, even though they have a reputation of deer resistance, I would not argue that it's great resistance in general. Okay, so let's look at some of the options for managing deer. Repellent products are available, and there definitely are some that I think are of value. So the key thing is you may need reapplication, especially after a rain or X period of time. Individually, they vary in effectiveness, and generally none of these repellents can be used on a plant whose part you will eat even later on that summer, because as you see, some of them are kind of microbiologically questionable. So let's take a look at what we've got. Back east with the deer in Iowa and places like that, they use a lot of what I call the bitter or burn repellents. Capsaicin is the active ingredient in hot peppers, and quinine is quinine. It's a very bitter type of compound. Again, those seem to have zero impact, from what I can tell, on our deer. Bringing in cougar scat, and we have people that work at the zoo, and they can get things like cougar scat. The problem is that cougar scat or coyote scat actually communicates with other cougars and coyotes, and they come to investigate who's in their territory, which is also not a good idea. So I don't like those. The classic portfolio of repellents that work to me are what I call the rotten things. So we've got a rotten egg mixture. BGR, big game repellent, was developed by Weyerhaeuser, and it really was the first useful repellent for the Pacific Northwest. It was developed about 50 years ago, and if you read the active ingredients statement, it says putrescent egg solids. Okay, so rotten eggs. Blood meal has been used for years. Our Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife used to give out little blood meal sachets that you could hang on your trees like ornaments. And I think that worked pretty well. And there's some forms like this plant skid that's shown in the picture there is, I think, a form either of fermented blood meal or just plain blood meal, but it's actually quite an effective repellent. And then there's some ammonium fatty acids in some of these as well. Somebody recently told me that hydrolyzed casein, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a milk byproduct. If you take things that far, works. And I've actually discovered in my own experimenting with, in the beginning, just soured milk, and later on with milk that wasn't soured, that actually milk is a fairly good repellent as far as I can tell. It does seem to stick and adhere pretty well, and I don't think it needs to be soured. So in an emergency, I would not hesitate to suggest to somebody that they try milk as a potential repellent, although there's no label for this or anything like that. And I wouldn't use, obviously, I would not use it on anything you would be eating, because the microbiology of that is probably not great. Okay, and so repellent rules early and often, rotation of types, and basically you have to be comfortable with the notion that you're sending your deer to your neighbors as you change your deer behavior, and you have to be cognizant of the fact that your neighbors may respond in a variety of different ways. So it could be a war of repellents, or who knows. But anyway, that the whole idea of the repellent rules are that early and often. So you want to make sure that those does who are in, again, late lactation or late pregnancy or early lactation, their demand is high and they're really testing the system, and you want to get them away at that point in time so that they can't develop a pattern of, this is where I want to eat forever. In their minds, because that's not what you want. So anyway, this Deer Away is one of those putrescent egg solid ones. The Plants Kit is another one that was a blood meal, as I mentioned, product. And then here are two that work, and one that I've pretty much convinced does not work. But or if it works, it doesn't work super well. So Bobex, pretty good. The Liquid Fence deer and rabbit repellent, pretty good. Not tonight deer, very, very marginal. In both my personal experience testing some of these and in the experience of other people that have tried it and said, why didn't this work? So that's kind of what I have. So before we go on to fencing, are there any questions about repellents or anything in that nature?
Chip, are you able to access the chat, or do you want me to read it off to you?
I can't see the chat at all.
Okay, let's see. Thank you for coming to class. That one. Somebody said for elk, a solid fence is more helpful.
Right.
Somebody said they eat my salad all the time. It's 5 to 6 inches of sword fern.
Yeah.
Vine maple they eat trilliums.
Yeah.
Smoke
They'll eat the
bush is
flowers
one
on.
of the few
They'll
that
eat
is-
the flowers on trilliums. They typically don't eat the leaf. But again, deer are mysterious creatures. So
Question, are deer repellents bad for bees or affect bees? Do you know?
that is a good question. Most of the time, if I've been using one or talking to people, it's usually not on something. I don't think they are. I don't think they do affect bees though, because I've had people that have used them, trying as what a difficult kind of process it is, but trying to keep roses out of deer mouths, and I don't think that they feel they've lost any floral activity. I suppose if you spray directly onto an open flower, that might change the behavior, but the bee or the bumblebee behavior. But if it were unopened, I don't think it would. And it would open afterwards, that kind of thing. So I would say in general, my sense is it does not change bee behavior very much.
Next comment, those using, or she's been using liquid fence, has had really good luck with it. It stinks until dried.
Mhm.
She's spraying it about every 10 days.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
and somebody said they sprayed liquid fence on most of their shrubs and they see plenty of bees on the plants.
Yeah.
Another question, can blood meal attract rats?
That is a question, and I've had several people say that they think it did, but the proof of whether that was actually why the rats were there was to me in the discussion. I couldn't really see whether there was a cause and effect thing there, because in the one discussion I've had about that, there apparently had been some rats already there when we really got down to it. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer. It's possible, though.
That catches you up the questions in the chat.
Okay, so let's go on to fencing. Fencing really, if you're a gardener, fencing ultimately is, you're going to want to do that at some point in time. And for us, it was when they ate some of that garlic that I said, okay, this is it. We've got to end up. And so we ended up putting, this isn't it, but we ended up putting up an 8-foot fence. And, with the standard metal fencing and all that. So anyway, that would work both for deer, of course, and for elk. So I will not say a 6-foot fence would work for deer because they actually are good jumpers. People have said that elk won't jump 6 feet. I've seen them jump a 4-foot fence. So we'll see. So anyway, some people have started stringing a hot wire along the upper part of a fence because the deer or the elk will sometimes come and test that first. We'll talk about straight electric fences in a little bit, but again, I don't know. Usually it's better to have a higher fence and not worry about that hot wire than the hot wire. But it could be something as an emergency or a short-term solution, it might be something that could help. Temporary fish line fences never work for very long. Usually the fawns figure out how to get underneath them, then the moms follow, and then it's all over. So these fish line fences, 20 or 30 or pound test, they just don't work very long. Temporarily, maybe, yeah, otherwise not. Interestingly, the regular cedar deer fence is surprisingly good because deer do not like to jump over something that they can't see what's behind it, what they're jumping into. And so they've actually worked surprisingly well, especially if you have a gate that's equally tall and doesn't give them any room to wiggle underneath. So these fences, there's quite a bit of maintenance involved in them and quite a bit of initial construction costs, but from my experience, they work well. The only situation that I ever heard that they did not work, and it turned out to be not a great deal, was that there was an uphill from the fence on the outside of the fence, and they could get up a little bit and then they jumped over, but then they couldn't. The only way they could get back out easily, because they didn't want to jump back, was actually the gate, and that turned out to be really a fiasco, but it ended up finally okay for everybody. But there was a lot of, it was a tough getting them out. So anyway, but these fences work. These regular fences work for sure, I think. I'm going to give you some examples of what I call the urban welded wire fence. We have a lot of cities in Oregon that have a lot of deer in them, just like we in the country do as well. So they have, you can see in some of the towns in Oregon, some pretty elaborate deer fencing that has come up out of that. And they're very attractive fences. So there's one. I'll show you another one in a minute. The classic deer fencing, this was not actually a nursery that I was helping at one point, and this was the deer fence they put up after some years and decided it was a good thing. They have a couple of pieces of advice, and that is really see if there's any dips, because if there's dips, the deer will find it. If the dip is 6 inches or more, they'll find it and they'll skinny their way underneath. They use a little bit of, they did lose crop area by having the fence, and they also lost some efficiency. They couldn't, there were only certain places they could come through, so they had to redirect how the logistics of basically how they worked in the area and harvested and got that kind of stuff done. But because it was a bare root tree and shrub operation. But anyway, they are very effective though, and for years Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife used to offer half the cost of a deer fence to build it, but they stopped doing that about 20 years ago or 25 years ago. So anyway, you do have to make sure to leave the gates closed when you leave, because leaving them open puts the deer in a terrible position later on. That's usually never a good thing. Okay, so just some other examples of commercial fencing. This is pretty light material, but it's sufficient. This is pretty fancy again, but there you go. And electric fencing is not practical in city limits, but it is fairly effective. It can be both a psychological deterrent once they've touched it once. Some deer will test it and apparently are willing to stand it, but most won't. So they do have an incredible sense of when it's not powered. So they show up, the power lines are down somewhere, fence is down in terms of power, and all of a sudden the deer are enjoying themselves. So but they do work, and there's quite a few farms that have gone to electric fencing as a major tool to manage deer in their operations. So there's here on the left you have what we call a hot tape that's out from what is a relatively low fence, but that hot tape is a discouraging tape, and that does work for them. And then this is called it's an electric fence that you can roll up, and so it's very short term, but unless they really decide to jump over it, if they put their nose on it, they do understand that it's an electric fence. And again, just a couple of more examples of some commercial operations. This one on the right was actually a nursery for a long time. It's now closed, but Joy Creek Nursery, maybe some of you have been there before, but this was their perimeter fencing for managing deer on their property. It really worked for them pretty well. They felt they had about 95% or more control over the deer coming in and out of that location. So they were quite happy with that in terms of its ability to do what they wanted it to do, and kind of the minimum time and cost that it took to get it put up, and those kinds of things. So yeah, they felt it was very, very useful. So any questions about fencing itself? We're kind of getting semi to the end. Any questions about what you've learned from putting up fencing, or comments that would be helpful to the other listeners?
Stephanie said fencing has worked well for me. It was a last resort for her.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the only comment I got. I don't know if anybody else wants to speak up, please do.
I have found that by the end of this summer, especially as our summers are getting drier and drier and the vegetation is getting really dry, that if you don't have fencing, your anything, all your food will just be, or not food, but just they eat so many plants that you don't
Yes.
expect them to eat.
Yes. Yes. No, that is absolutely true. I think. Okay, well, all I have now is just a few other things. Individual tree protection. If you've been around forestry at all, you'll know that as we talked about kind of early on in this, that trying to keep the leader protected is super important. You can lose some side branches, but you've got to get that leader up to what we call free to grow. That is the forestry term for this tree is going to make it. It's above the deer browse or elk browse zone, and we're going for it. So these individual protection tools, like Vexar tubes and things like that, are very, very useful in the forestry industry, and I think can be used for certain kinds of things in the home garden, but not very much, because they're really focused on a conifer leader kind of situation. So unfortunately, deer and elk both like to pull them off for pure entertainment, I think. So, but you do want to keep moving them up as the leaders grow. That's pretty important. And there's all sorts of different other techniques that you can use for starting individual tree protection. So, and it can be very useful in certain situations where a fence is impractical and you want to keep deer, or in some cases other animals like beaver, especially if you're near a creek that has beaver. You want to develop an individual protection that can protect that tree from being gnawed down by the beaver. So that's not this talk, but yeah, we definitely encourage that. And then hazing, we have water scarecrows. I'll show you in a minute. Rubber bullets. You have to get a permit from ODF&W in Oregon. I don't know what it is in Washington. These bangers and screamers and shell crackers and propane cannons. Those are really aren't. Those really aren't what a small community or a neighborhood want to be hearing. So you can't really do that there. They generally need some kind of permit for any of these things. So I'm not going to spend any more time on that, but I will talk about this confusing deer deal. People have tried using radios tied to motion detectors or not tied to motion detectors. Some people have just had the radio out in the garden, going through whatever the individual thinks is the most disgusting thing they've heard on the radio. Somehow they think the deer will respond the same. I think there's probably some reasonable research that could be tested what deer like or don't like, but so far nobody has done that in terms of what you could get out of a radio station, whether it's classical music or talk radio or whatever. But anyway, but generally they've turned out not to be useful. Lights on motion detectors have turned out not to be useful in general. So I don't think those are worth considering particularly. These sprinklers with a motion detector, kind of yes. If you plan well, but the thing is they only can shoot in a certain range of water, and so they do kind of work. But I had a friend who had one of these, a series of these around the garden on the coast, and he caught the deer going underneath this thing on their knees so they wouldn't be setting it off. So in general, I would say marginal. That's about it. I would say in general, maybe, but pretty marginal. They do weirdly, apparently work on raccoons, which surprised me amazingly when somebody told me that. But at least in their situation, worked on raccoons in the protection of a koi pond. And you'd think a koi pond, they're going to be in that pond getting wet. What's a little extra sprinkler? But I think it's the pressure maybe and the surprise and the noise. So who knows? But for deer, I would say pretty marginal. And I guess that's it. So I would be more than happy to try to answer any questions you have, and go from there.
Thanks, Chip. Let me see. I've got from Sarah, I had a 6-foot deer fence and bunny fence that added 3.5 feet of plastic deer fence at the top. that stopped them until they found a spot to slip through between the neighbors. So I built a wood fence, no deer since.
Right.
Teresa says, our dog has been our best defense. When he died 2 years ago, that's when we had our deer invasion. Until that happened, I didn't realize how much he kept the deer away. And
Right.
Stephanie says, neighbor across the road is trying something that makes a high-pitched sound we can't hear. But I didn't invest in those because I read online that deer just become accustomed to them.
Okay. Yeah,
Um,
that
I-
doesn't surprise me, because deer can adjust their behavior based on what they'll test a threat modestly, and if nothing seems to happen, like getting closer to that high-pitched noise that we can't hear, if nothing happens, then they'll continue to test. And yeah.
I would say, yeah, I had an acre and a half. And I had one of our fruit trees strategically that covered a lot of that area, not all of it, tied a rope on it, and that rope went to the back door. And so when we let our dog out, which was not really good about coming back, we'd snap him in place. First time we did that, he saw the deer and he took off. Of course, when he hit the end of the rope, it was a surprise to him, but the deer were gone.
Right.
It took about 2 months, and they knew exactly where that rope was and how far he could go.
Right.
And I swear they're just laughing at him.
Yeah,
So they
no.
become real accustomed to that stuff really
Yeah.
quickly.
No, I've heard that story too, especially if they have they have dogs on, some of these electric shocker things to keep them within a boundary. The deer figure out exactly how far they can go with that. And that's all they do. It's quite amazing. One interesting thing has been, if there's been a dog outside for a long time, it seems to take a while for the deer to realize that the dog has passed.
Yeah.
Often as much as 6 or 7 weeks, I've had people tell me that not weeks, months, excuse me,
Yeah.
that a dog that had been there and ready to chase them for a long time is no longer there, and it does take a long time for them to adjust. Yeah.
It does. They talk about the 21-day back guarantee, and they say if you can keep an animal and change its behavior for 21 days, you can actually modify it. And I think that's what you're kind of saying, is that it takes them a while to realize that a change has occurred, and all of a sudden, oh, we do have access to this area.
Yeah. And the thing is, so we're living in both a deer environment and a human environment. And if you're sending the deer to one of your neighbors, then they're going to take action. It might be a block or two away, but they're going to start taking action too. And so, it becomes like just a back and forth of, who gets the deer this week. But yeah, it's challenging. I mean, the number of deer in our landscapes right now are just incredible. Although I will say, and it's not based on any real data, but we have, I think, one of the lowest fawn crops that we've ever seen in our neighborhood. We just are not seeing hardly any fawns at all this year. And so I don't know what led to that. I don't know what the dynamic of that is, but it's been interesting, and that's going to have some repercussions down the line in terms of the overall population. I actually think there may be more cougar activity than we know right now, and that may be having both an impact on where the deer are and also how many there are.
Yeah. Teresa asked a question, or really a comment. Maybe the heat has driven deer to higher ground.
Yeah, or they have to have moisture too. I mean, they get X amount of moisture out of the grass, out of some of the foliage they're eating, but they do need water. And I think that may be driving deer to different places as well right now, because it's been quite dry. Did you get a shower over there the other day a little bit?
We did. For some people, they said it wasn't even enough to knock the dust down.
Right.
I
Right.
dare say that if I put a shovel in the ground, I don't think you see anything of it.
Right. No, there's really no. I've done a couple of probes with a soil probe just to check in certain situations where people were having trouble growing something, and there's just no moisture in the profile much at this point. We have a couple of Japanese maples, and they do not seem to eat them, but there are so many different varieties, with so many different characteristics in their in the chemicals, if you will, the natural plant chemicals that are in that thing that may be repellent to some deer, may not be again to other deer, or may be there in lesser quantities and don't hit the threshold of being repellent. So, yeah.